The highway into Cedar Ridge always felt too long. Too empty. Like the world grew wider the closer I got to home. Tall pines swallowed the sky on both sides, their shadows stretching across the cracked asphalt in long, dark ribbons. I rolled down the window and let the cool June air hit my face. The smell of rain-soaked dirt and old timber was so familiar it almost hurt. I hadn't meant to come back. Not really. Not after a year of pretending I'd finally broken free of this small, stubborn town tucked deep inside the Washington mountains. But when my lease collapsed and my savings evaporated, there was nowhere else to go except the house on the ridge where I'd grown up. The house that sat just close enough to the clouds to feel like it was watching the whole world. My dad didn't say much when I told him I was coming home for the summer. He never did. Ray Brooks wasn't a man built for words. He was a mechanic, a former Marine, a worker whose shoulders always looked like they'd been carrying something heavier than tools. He wasn't cold, just quiet. The kind of quiet that grows out of life, not choice. The driveway twisted upward through wet fir trees before finally opening into the clearing where our house stood. A two-story cabin with a wraparound porch, patched in places from storms that had rolled through over the years. One side of the porch sagged slightly, waiting for repairs. Dad always said he'd fix it one day, but life rarely left him enough free evenings to keep promises to wood and nails. I parked next to his old Ford, grabbed my duffel and stepped out. The gravel crunched under my shoes, that same familiar crunch I'd heard since I was small enough to run barefoot through this yard. The screen door opened, and Dad stepped out, wiping his hands with a rag that looked just as worn as the truck behind him. "You made it," he said. His voice was low, steady, the same as always. I nodded. Yeah, drive wasn't too bad. Good. He didn't ask about school, or the lease, or the fact that I'd sounded barely above water last time I called. He didn't need to. His eyes softened in a way that meant he already knew everything he wasn't asking. Inside, the house smelled of cedar, old coffee, and a hint of motor oil. Dad's cologne, basically. The floors creaked under my steps, the same way they always had. The living room looked unchanged. Faded plaid couch, crooked family photos, the fireplace stonework still stained from the night I attempted to cook marshmallows indoors at 10 years old. But something did feel different. A second coffee mug sat on the kitchen table. Clean, but placed like someone had used it recently. There were 2 plates in the drying rack instead of 1. And the old cot in the hallway, the one Dad never used unless he had company, had fresh sheets. I pointed at the cot. Expecting someone? He hesitated only for a breath, but enough for me to notice. Yeah. An old friend's stopping by for a while. Oh? From the shop. No, he folded the rag slowly. From the Marines. Jack Mercer. I'd heard the name before. Not often, but enough to know it meant something. Dad didn't talk about his Marine days unless a story slipped through like a splinter working its way out. And even then, they were vague. Places without names. Faces without details. But sometimes he'd say Mercer, with that tone people use for someone who once saved their life or broke it. I didn't push. Dad wasn't a man who cracked open easily. Upstairs, my room looked exactly like I'd left it. Posters peeling, books leaning at awkward angles. The window cracked where a baseball had flown through during high school. I flopped onto the bed, letting my eyes close. The softness of home felt both comforting and suffocating. Later, I woke to the rumble of Dad's voice outside. A second voice, deeper, steady, unfamiliar, mixed with his. Gravel shifted. A truck door slammed. I went to the window instinctively, and I saw him. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of a dusty pickup. His hair was dark at the roots but streaked with silver, cut short in that practical ex-military way. His skin was sun-worn, tanned, with lines that made him look strong rather than old. One hand carried a duffel bag. The other reached out as Dad pulled him into a hug. Jack Mercer. It struck me how rare it was to see my father smile like that, openly, warmly, like part of him woke up when Jack arrived. I stayed at the window longer than I meant to, not hiding, just observing. Something about the man's presence held me still. Not intimidating, not threatening, just grounding. Like he belonged anywhere he stepped. Their voices drifted through the walls for the next hour, Low laughter, stories I couldn't make out. Eventually I forced myself downstairs, pretending I just needed water. Dad was on the couch. Jack sat in the armchair angled toward him, relaxed in a way that suggested long history, long trust. When Jack stood to greet me, I felt his presence fill the room before he even said a word. "This your boy?" he asked, glancing at my dad. Dad nodded. "This is Evan." Jack extended a hand. "Good to meet you, Evan." Up close, he looked even more like someone carved from another life. Broad chest under a faded flannel, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms scarred from years of work and war. His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who'd learned never to hesitate. "You're taller than Ray described," Jack added, a small smile tugging at his mouth. I shrugged awkwardly. "I grew." He laughed quietly. The sound was warm, real, the kind that came from deep in the chest rather than through the teeth. Dad went back to reminiscing, telling stories from the Marines that I'd never heard before. Jack filled in the pieces without dramatizing anything. Battlefields became deserts. Chaos became weather. Pain became something to carry rather than complain about. I watched the two of them, trying to imagine my dad as the young man Jack described. Reckless, stubborn, brave. Couldn't. And yet, in their shared glances, I saw echoes of a past they both survived. Hours passed. Evening settled. Rain began tapping softly against the windows, a familiar Pacific Northwest lullaby. Eventually I excused myself for a shower. The pipes groaned like always. Steam filled the small bathroom, fogging the mirror until my reflection faded into haze. I wrapped a towel loosely around my waist and opened the door, and froze. Jack stood in the hall, reaching for the linen closet. He stopped mid-motion when he saw me, or rather, when we saw each other. His eyes flicked down for the briefest moment, then back up. Not in hunger, not in embarrassment. Something else. Something I didn't have a name for. "Oh, sorry," he said, stepping back. "No, you're fine," I muttered, gripping the towel tighter. The space between us felt thick, like the air had shifted without our permission. Jack cleared his throat, nodded once, and turned away. When his footsteps faded, I finally exhaled. But the moment stayed. Dinner was quieter. Dad talked about work. Jack listened. I stared at my plate more than I ate. Every time I risked a glance at Jack, he looked away. Or maybe he wasn't looking in the first place. Couldn't tell. Later, when I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, the house felt different. Smaller. Like someone new had stepped into its silence and rearranged it without touching anything. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, familiar. Jack's. Not coming to my room. Just passing by. Just existing. But somehow that alone made the air feel warmer. I told myself the tension I felt was nothing. I'd met him only hours ago. It was stupid to feel aware of someone so quickly. But the truth was simple. For the first time all year, I didn't feel like I was drifting. And it scared me more than anything. The next morning started the same way mornings in Cedar Ridge always did, with silence thick enough to hear the refrigerator hum and the distant rumble of logging trucks groaning down the main road. I woke to the scent of coffee drifting up the stairs and the faint clinking of mugs. Dad always moved quietly, but somehow Jack moved quieter, as if he'd spent years training his body to take up space without ever disturbing it. When I finally went down, Dad had already left for the garage. A note on the table saying he'd be gone all day, maybe overnight if the transmission job ran long. That wasn't unusual. Work swallowed him whenever it wanted. What was unusual was Jack sitting alone at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled, reading the newspaper like he belonged here. Steam curled from the mug between his hands. He glanced up. "Morning." His voice was low, warm in a way that made the room feel smaller. "Morning," I said, reaching for a clean mug. He slid the coffee pot toward me without looking away. A small, simple gesture, but it landed somewhere inside me I wasn't prepared for. "Your dad said the porch beam needs fixing," he said after a moment. "If you've got time, I could use a hand." I nodded, maybe too quickly. "Yeah, sure. I can help." Outside, The air was cool and damp from last night's rain. The boards on the porch were slick with moisture, the smell of pine and wet soil rising in waves. Jack crouched near the stairs, tapping along the edge of a loose beam with a hammer. "Hold this," he said, handing me a plank. Working beside him felt natural and awkward all at once. He wasn't loud, didn't fill silence with meaningless chatter. He worked with the kind of focus that made you feel safe just being near him. When he measured the plank, his knuckle brushed mine. Light, accidental, but enough to make my pulse jump. He didn't react, or if he did, he hid it behind that calm marine expression. After an hour, he stood and wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. The sun pushed through the clouds, making the world feel sharper around the edges. "You work hard," he said, nodding at the beam we just secured. I shrugged, trying not to sound flustered. "Learned from him." Jack smiled faintly. "Ray always said you'd turn out useful." I pretended to laugh. High praise. We took a break on the porch steps, breathing in the damp air. Jack poured lemonade into 2 glasses he'd brought out earlier. We sat shoulder to shoulder but not touching, each sip cold enough to make the back of my neck tighten. "Your dad mentioned you study design?" he asked. "Trying to. Some days it feels right. Some days it feels like I'm forcing myself to be someone I'm not." He nodded slowly. "You're 21. You're not supposed to know who you are." Hell, I didn't know who I was at 40. I looked at him. "Do you know now?" Jack's eyes lowered to the glass in his hand. "Still figuring it out." There was something heavy behind the words, a weight I didn't know how to reach. We worked the rest of the afternoon, sanding, measuring, rebuilding sections of the railing. As hours passed, I found myself noticing things about him I hadn't before. The gentle burn of sun on his neck. The way he hummed softly under his breath when he concentrated. The small scar beneath his jaw. The careful, steady rhythm of his breath. At one point, he guided my hand to show me how to align the nails straighter. "Here," he murmured, standing behind me, his chest almost brushing my back. The heat of him was sudden, unexpected, and my entire body went tense. His fingers curled over mine, rough, warm, sure, and for that 1 second, the world narrowed into the shape of his hand over mine. Then he let go. "Good," he said quietly. I wasn't sure if he knew what that moment did to me, or if he was avoiding knowing. By early evening, clouds gathered again, heavy and swollen over the treeline. Thunder rolled low and distant. Jack looked up. "Storm's coming," and he said it like someone who could smell rain long before the sky ever broke open. Inside, the cabin felt dim, the air thick. The storm arrived fast. Rain crashing against the windows, wind rattling the gutters. Lightning cracked, bathing the room in white for a heartbeat. Then the lights flickered, then died. "Power's out," Jack muttered. He found matches quickly, like he already knew where everything lived. Within minutes, a few candles were glowing across the kitchen, their warm light dancing over the wood walls and casting shadows that felt alive. "You scared of storms?" he asked casually as he placed a candle on the table. "No, just don't like the dark sometimes." He nodded. "Most people don't." He reached for the cabinet above the fridge and pulled down a dusty bottle of whiskey. "Ray keeps this for special occasions. I'd say this qualifies." He poured 2 glasses. No ice, no water, just amber warmth and stormlight. The first sip burned my throat, then settled like fire low in my chest. Jack watched me over the rim of his glass, his expression calm but unreadable. "Tell me something true," he said suddenly. "What kind of something?" "Anything. Something you don't say out loud much." I swallowed. The storm outside roared. The cabin groaned under a strong gust. "I feel lost," I whispered. "And I don't think I'm supposed to admit that anymore." He leaned back slightly, but his eyes softened. "You're allowed to feel lost. Being grown doesn't erase that." "What about you?" I asked. "Something true." A long moment passed. "I've loved people I wasn't supposed to," he said quietly. "And I've spent most of my life pretending I didn't." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the candle, the flame flickering gently as though it sensed the shift in the air. My heart thudded painfully. His words weren't aimed at me. They weren't a confession. They were a scar he let me see because the storm made the world too honest to hide. When the record player crackled to life with an old tune, neither of us moved to change it. The melody filled the room like a memory we hadn't lived yet. Minutes dripped into silence. Silence stretched into something else. Something warm, electric, terrifying. We reached for the whiskey bottle at the same time. Our fingers touched. Just the tips. Just a brush. But neither of us pulled away fast enough to pretend it hadn't happened. Jack exhaled slowly, almost shakily. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, voice low. "Maybe I do," I whispered. He shook his head, jaw tightening. "You're young. You're you. And you're acting like this is something you don't feel too," I said before I could stop myself. His eyes snapped up to mine. The storm cracked loud behind us. "Evan." He didn't finish my name. Couldn't. The air between us pulled tight like a wire. Then he stood abruptly. "We should try to sleep before the candles run out." He blew out 3 of them, leaving only one flickering weakly. We carried it into the living room, the shadows stretching along the walls. He sat on one end of the couch. I sat on the other. Between us, a gap that felt too wide and too narrow at the same time. The candle died sometime around midnight. In the darkness, I felt him shift, felt the couch dip, felt the warmth of his arm near mine. Not touching, just there. Storm thundering outside. My heartbeat thundering inside. I didn't sleep, and I don't think he did either. Not really, because the space between us, silent, charged, fragile, was louder than any lightning that hit the sky. Dad came home 2 days earlier than he said he would. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of hot, heavy summer day when the air feels too thick to breathe and the sky looks like it's holding secrets. I was sanding the final strip of railing on the porch. Jack was fixing the hinge on the screen door. We'd spent the whole morning pretending the storm night hadn't changed everything, even though the silence between us felt sharper than any argument could have been. Every time our eyes met, we both looked away too fast. Every time our hands brushed, he stepped back like he'd touched something burning. The engine of Dad's truck growled up the gravel drive. A sound I'd grown up with, a sound I always felt before I heard. I froze. Jack did too. Dad stepped out, boots hitting the ground with that familiar thud. His shirt was streaked with dust and oil, his hair flattened from wearing a cap too long. He walked toward us with a tired smile, the kind he used to give after long days at the garage. "Hey," he said. "Didn't expect me yet, did you?" Jack cleared his throat. "Thought you'd be back Saturday. Finished early." Dad's eyes flicked between us just a fraction too long. "Figured it'd be good to sleep in my own bed." He walked past us into the house. Jack let out a quiet breath, shoulders loosening only a little. I picked up the sandpaper again even though my hands shook. Inside, the house felt smaller. Dad unpacked his toolbox on the kitchen counter like normal, but the atmosphere wasn't normal. It was thick, observant. His gaze lingered on the table where there were 2 coffee mugs instead of 1. On the porch railing showing fresh nails. On the 2 pairs of boots drying by the door. He wasn't stupid. That night, dinner was most of what I dreaded it would be. Dad asked about the porch. Jack answered. Dad asked about the weather. I answered. Every question felt like he was testing the room for cracks. Jack barely spoke except to confirm details about the repairs. His shoulders were stiff. His jaw stayed tight. Even his voice felt guarded, like he'd pulled something heavy around him to keep us both safe. When dinner ended, Dad leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, studying us in that heavy silence that Marines tend to use more than words. "You two got quiet," he said. "Something happened while I was gone?" My fork nearly slipped out of my hand. Jack didn't flinch, but his eyes hardened just slightly, the way they did when he sensed danger. "No," I said quickly. "Just tired." Dad nodded slowly, like he didn't believe a word of it. He stayed up late, watching TV in the living room. Jack stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes he didn't need to wash. I stood outside on the porch, letting the darkness swallow me because there was nowhere else to put the tension lodged in my chest. Eventually, I went to my room, but sleep didn't come. I lay on my side staring at the wall, waiting for something. I didn't know what to break. Around midnight, Dad's voice cut through the house. Low at first, then sharper, then unmistakably angry. I sat up instantly. I followed the sound to the living room. The lights were low, just the lamp beside Dad's chair. Dad stood in front of the couch, fists clenched at his sides. Jack stood opposite him, calm but rigid, a soldier bracing for impact. "You crossed a line," Dad was saying. His voice wasn't loud, but it was the kind of quiet that shakes walls. My stomach dropped. Jack didn't defend himself. He didn't look away. He stood there like a man ready to take blame just to keep someone else safe. "It's not what you think," Jack said, the words steady. Dad stepped closer, eyes blazing. "Then tell me, because I'm looking at you and my son, and I know something isn't right." I moved before I could think. "Dad, stop." He turned so fast I felt the air shift. For a moment he just stared at me, searching, piecing together everything he must have been suspecting since he walked through the door. "So it's true," he said quietly, and the disappointment in his voice hit like a punch. The room spun. I swallowed hard. "Nothing happened," I said. "It's not like that." Dad's jaw clenched. "Then what is it?" I looked at Jack. His eyes told me not to say anything, not to make this worse. But something inside me cracked open. "I care about him," I said in a breath I couldn't stop. "More than I meant to." Dad's face went still, white, like all the color drained out in one heartbeat. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that after everything, after I welcomed him, you're standing here confessing this?" "Dad." He raised a hand, silencing me. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," I whispered. "For once, I actually do." He turned on Jack then, eyes like fire. "You're twice his age," he snarled. "You're supposed to protect him, not—" "Don't," Jack said sharply. Not angry, just firm. "Don't talk to him like that." My father's rage came fast, sharp. "You don't get to stand in my house and tell me how to talk to my son." Jack's expression tightened. "He's a grown man. He's 21. So was I when you trusted me with your life," Jack shot back. Silence rooted itself between them. Heavy. Dangerous. Dad stepped forward, fists curling. "You slept under my roof. Ate my food. And you." "I didn't cross that line," Jack said firmly. "Even when I wanted to." My heart dropped to my stomach. Dad recoiled like the words hit him physically. Then he pointed to the hallway. "Get your things," he said. "You're gone by morning." Jack didn't move. "Now." Something in Jack's face shifted. Something sad, resigned, inevitable. He nodded once, almost like a salute. "I understand." He walked past Dad without a word. His footsteps echoed down the hall. I wanted to follow immediately, but Dad stepped into my path. "You're staying away from him," he said. "I'm not a kid," I snapped. "You're my son. That doesn't mean you can decide what I feel." He looked like I'd broken something sacred in him. "He's been through hell," Dad said quietly, "and that doesn't make him fit to drag you into his." I pushed past him. Jack's door was open. His duffel sat on the bed half-packed. He folded his shirts neatly, almost carefully, as if the act of leaving required gentleness. "I'm sorry," I said. He shook his head. "You don't have to be. Don't let him make you feel like—" "It's not about him," Jack said, voice low. "I shouldn't have stayed. I should have known better." My throat tightened. "You could stay. He'll calm down." "No," he said. "You know he won't." "Then I'll go with you." He froze. Slowly, painfully, he looked up, and the expression on his face nearly undid me. "No," he whispered. "You won't." "Why not?" "Because you've got your whole life ahead of you," he said. "And me, I'd only make it smaller." "That's not true." "It is." He zipped his bag. Each click of the zipper sounded like a door closing. He stepped past me into the hall, walked to the front door, and didn't look back. The screen door creaked shut. The house swallowed his absence instantly. I stood in the hallway staring at the shadows, heart thundering against my ribs. Dad sat in his chair, silent now. Not angry, just exhausted, maybe afraid. The house felt hollow, like something had been ripped out of the air. I went to my room and closed the door slowly, pressing my forehead against the wood. Through the window, I watched Jack's figure walk down the gravel path into the night. The rain started again, light at first, then steady. It soaked through his jacket, through the dirt, through the summer that had barely begun. He didn't look back. And somehow, even though the sound of his footsteps faded, I knew one thing the moment he disappeared into the trees. Nothing in my life would ever be the same again. Time moved strangely after Jack left. The first week dragged like molasses, every day weighed down by a silence that seemed to seep into the walls. Dad tried acting normal, waking early, making coffee, leaving for the garage before the sun fully climbed over the ridge. But something in him had cracked. I could see it in the way he hovered before walking out the door, or how he paused before speaking, like he was choosing his words more carefully than ever before. He didn't mention Jack. Not once. And I didn't bring him up either. We drifted around each other like two people living in the same house but in different worlds. I spent most days outside or hiding in my room, trying to study for classes I wasn't sure I even wanted to return to. Nights were the worst. Everything echoed. The porch boards creaked with memory. The living room smelled faintly of the whiskey we'd shared during the storm. And the couch still held a dip where Jack had slept that night. Every part of the house felt touched by him, marked by his presence in ways I couldn't scrub away. By late August, I packed my bags for Seattle and left without much ceremony. Dad stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, squinting at the road like the sunlight offended him. "You take care," he said. "You too." He nodded, hesitating like he might say more. But he didn't. The drive back to the city felt hollow. The highway stretched ahead in long, lonely lines, rain streaking across the windshield. I turned on the radio to drown my thoughts, but every song seemed to echo the memory of Jack's low voice, his quiet laugh, the way he'd said my name like it meant something. I told myself it would fade. People leave. People move on. You stop wondering where they are, what they're doing, whether they ever think about you. But the truth was, I didn't stop. Not when I returned to campus and saw couples laughing by the fountain. Not when I sat in design class, trying to hold a pencil steady while my thoughts wandered back to the cabin. Not when autumn rain tapped against my dorm window and dragged me back to that storm-lit night on the couch beside him. A part of me stayed on that ridge, in that house, in that moment. The months that followed were a blur of deadlines and distractions. I learned how to pretend again, laughing with friends, going to parties, pulling all-nighters. On the outside, I looked like every other 20-something trying to figure out life. But at night, when everything went still, my mind returned to him. To the way he held a hammer. To the quiet strength in his posture. To the sadness in his eyes when he said he shouldn't stay. I didn't know if I was supposed to move on or hold on to something that never really had the chance to begin. Winter arrived early that year, coating the city in thin ice and fog that swallowed the streetlights. Finals week hit hard, and I buried myself in work to stay afloat. On a cold December morning, I stopped by the campus mailroom between classes. I wasn't expecting anything. No one mailed letters anymore. But there it was. Plain white envelope. No return address. My name written in blocky, careful handwriting. My heart stopped. I knew instantly. I stood there holding it, surrounded by students grabbing packages and joking loudly. But all the noise faded into a long, distant hum. My fingers trembled as I tore the envelope open. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, folded neatly. The first line nearly buckled my knees. "Evan, I hope you're doing all right." I read every word slowly, afraid I might miss something if I blinked. I wasn't sure if I should write, but silence has a cruelty I can't accept anymore. I didn't want that to be the last thing I left you with. My chest tightened. I sank onto a bench, blocking out the world around me. You did nothing wrong. That summer wasn't a mistake. You saw something in me I thought was gone for good, something decent. He wrote about leaving Cedar Ridge. about drifting from town to town, about taking odd jobs until he found steady work at a small repair shop in eastern Washington. He wrote about his daughter, how she'd finally replied to one of his messages. He wrote about my father, how he hoped Dad would someday soften enough to forgive himself. And then he wrote the line that broke me open. I didn't stay because I respected you more than I trusted myself. I read that sentence over and over until the ink seemed to blur. Not because it was painful, but because it was true. I didn't want to break something important in you, Evan. I didn't want to be the reason your life took a smaller shape. My hands shook as I reached the final lines. You'll love again. Better. Truer. Don't hide from it when it finds you. Jack. I didn't move for a long time after finishing the letter. Students walked past, unaware that my entire world had shifted in the span of a few paragraphs. I pressed the pages to my chest and closed my eyes. He hadn't disappeared. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't left because he didn't care. He left because he cared too damn much. That night I couldn't sleep. The city outside my window shimmered with holiday lights, but inside my apartment, everything felt still. I read the letter 3 more times until every word felt carved into me. When winter break came, I returned to Cedar Ridge. Not because I wanted to face my dad, though I knew I had to someday, but because something in me was pulled back to that house on the ridge like a compass needle turning north. Dad and I interacted carefully, like two people stepping around broken glass. But the air between us felt different. Softer, maybe, less sharp. He asked about school, about the city, about whether I was eating enough. The slow, careful questions of a father trying to rebuild something without knowing how. He never said Jack's name, but I could feel it hanging between us every time I looked at him. A few days into the break, I went wandering behind the house. Past the fallen log I used to climb as a kid, past the creek where I'd caught my first frog, up the narrow trail leading toward the old cabin Dad and Jack once used for storage. The cabin hadn't been touched in months. Moss covered half the roof. Leaves blocked the doorway. Inside, dust hung thick in the air like static. I walked in anyway. Tools were still lined neatly on the wall. Nails, wrenches, ropes, saws. Everything placed with the precision of men who'd lived through chaos and needed order to survive it. And then I saw it, draped over the back of a wooden chair near the window. Faded olive green, weathered at the collar, a rip near the cuff. Jack's jacket. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped forward slowly, like approaching something sacred. When I touched the fabric, a faint smell of cedar and tobacco clung to it, the same scent that used to linger on him after he worked outside. I closed my eyes, fingers gripping the worn cloth. The room felt too quiet, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. He had left it behind, not forgotten, not discarded, left, like a bookmark in a chapter neither of us finished. I sat in the chair and let the silence settle around me. Outside, wind rattled the bare branches. Inside, the memories came in waves. The storm, the candlelight, his hand brushing mine, the look he gave me before walking away. I didn't cry. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was something deeper, a recognition that not all love stories are meant to be lived to the end. Some are meant to wake you up, change you, push you toward the person you're meant to become. When I finally stood, I folded the jacket as carefully as if he might walk in and take it back any minute. I placed it exactly where I found it. Some things belong to memory, not possession. As I walked back down the trail toward home, the sky began to clear. A fresh chill settled over the ridge, crisp and clean. My chest felt lighter than it had since the night he left. Jack wasn't here, but he wasn't gone. He lived in the shape of who I was becoming, and somehow that was enough. Years passed in the quiet, unassuming way life often moves when you're not watching closely. College ended. I worked in Seattle for a while, then Portland, drifting through jobs that paid the bills but didn't quite fit. My 20s unfolded in uneven chapters. Messy breakups, friendships that came and went, long nights spent drawing or redesigning a logo until dawn, mornings fueled by too much coffee. I learned to carry responsibility, to admit mistakes, to stop running from my own emotions. But there were still nights, always nights, when something small would pull me back to that summer on Cedar Ridge. A certain kind of rain, the smell of sawdust, a low, steady voice in a movie that sounded just a little too much like his. I wondered about Jack more often than I admitted, even to myself. Wondered if he still worked in that small repair shop. Wondered if he ever drove past the ridge. Wondered if he regretted leaving as much as I regretted letting him walk away. By the time I turned 25, I had smoothed out enough of my life to feel steady. I'd taken a job at a design firm on the outskirts of Spokane, close enough to the mountains to breathe the air I grew up on, but far enough from Cedar Ridge that the past didn't hover over my shoulder. It was early autumn the day it happened. The kind of day where the sky turns a soft, tired gray and the wind carries the first hints of winter. After work, I drove out to a small diner that my coworkers loved, Riley's Junction, a place with worn vinyl booths, the smell of frying onions, and a waitress who'd been there so long she practically ran the place. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside. The place was half full, the hum of conversation mixing with the clatter of dishes. I slid into an empty booth, ordered a grilled cheese and tomato soup, and pulled out my sketchbook. I bent over a logo draft, barely aware of anything except the scratch of pencil. Then the bell over the door rang again. The sound was ordinary, nothing special. 100 people had walked in before without me looking up. But this time something in me snapped to attention. A familiar weight in the air. A shift. Presence I hadn't felt in years. I looked up. Jack stood in the doorway. Older, yes. His hair shorter, now threaded with more silver. His shoulders broader, as if the world had piled both burdens and strength onto him equally. He wore a dark flannel over a faded t-shirt, jeans slightly frayed at the pocket. His face was different, lined in ways it hadn't been before, like life had carved its stories into him without asking permission. But it was him, undeniably him. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. He didn't see me at first. He stood near the counter, speaking quietly to the waitress. Voice low, steady, unmistakable. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was sure the whole diner could hear it. For a second I considered looking away, pretending, staying hidden in the safety of distance. But something inside me refused. After all these years, after the letter that cracked open everything I thought I knew, after waking up countless mornings wondering if fate ever gave second chances, I couldn't just sit there. So I stood, slowly, like approaching a memory made real. He turned at that exact moment. His eyes landed on me. He froze. A soft, stunned breath escaped him, barely audible, but I felt it across the room. Evan? He said, voice roughened by surprise, by years, by something else I couldn't name. I stepped closer. Hey! For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared, taking each other in like we were learning a new language we already knew by heart, aware of anything except the scratch of pencil. Then the bell over the door rang again. The sound was ordinary, nothing special. 100 people had walked in before without me looking up. But this time something in me snapped to attention. A familiar weight in the air. A shift. Presence I hadn't felt in years. I looked up. Jack stood in the doorway. Older, yes. His hair shorter, now threaded with more silver. His shoulders broader, as if the world had piled both burdens and strength onto him equally. He wore a dark flannel over a faded t-shirt, jeans slightly frayed at the pocket. His face was different, lined in ways it hadn't been before, like life had carved its stories into him without asking permission. But it was him, undeniably him. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. He didn't see me at first. He stood near the counter, speaking quietly to the waitress. Voice low, steady, unmistakable. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was sure the whole diner could hear it. For a second I considered looking away, pretending, staying hidden in the safety of distance. But something inside me refused. After all these years, after the letter that cracked open everything I thought I knew, after waking up countless mornings wondering if fate ever gave second chances. I couldn't just sit there. So I stood. Slowly, like approaching a memory made real. He turned at that exact moment. His eyes landed on me. He froze. A soft, stunned breath escaped him, barely audible, but I felt it across the room. "Evan," he said, voice roughened by surprise, by years, by something else I couldn't name. I stepped closer. "Hey!" For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared, taking each other in like we were learning a new language we already knew by heart. I could say the same. The silence that followed was different. Not heavy, not painful, just waiting. Jack exhaled slowly. "I kept thinking I should have written again. I kept thinking I should have gone looking for you." His gaze snapped up to mine, sharp, searching. "Why didn't you?" "I was afraid you didn't want that." He looked like I'd surprised him, maybe even hurt him a little. "I wanted a lot of things," he said quietly. "Didn't mean I had the right to them." "Jack," he shook his head. "No, let me finish." I closed my mouth. He rubbed his hands together, old habit, something he did when words came hard. "When I left, I told myself it was the kind thing, the responsible thing. I'd convinced myself your life would shrink if I stayed in it. That wasn't your choice to make." "I know." His voice softened. "I know that now." The waitress dropped off my food, giving us a curious look before walking away. Neither of us touched anything. Jack continued, voice low but steady. "I thought distance would help. That if I stayed gone, maybe you'd forget what you felt. Maybe I'd forget too." He looked at me then, really looked. "But some people don't fade." My breath stilled. "You didn't fade either." He leaned back slightly, exhaling a shaky breath that betrayed more than he'd ever say outright. "Evan," he said softly, and hearing my name in his voice again nearly undid me. "I don't expect anything. I don't want to pull you into something complicated. I'm not 21 anymore." "I know." He smiled faintly. "That's part of why this is harder." I swallowed, heart pounding. "Do you still feel anything?" His jaw tightened. His shoulders rose and fell. When he spoke, his voice was rawer than I'd ever heard it. "I never stopped." The words hit me like a tidal wave, soft, overwhelming, undeniable. I leaned forward. "Then why are we still dancing around it?" He let out a slow, disbelieving laugh. "Because I'm afraid I'll mess it up again." "Then don't." My voice trembled. "Don't run this time." His eyes softened. He didn't answer right away, but something in him shifted, loosened, opened. Slowly, he reached across the table. Not fast, not boldly, just gently, like he was afraid I might pull away. I didn't. Our fingers brushed, paused, then intertwined with a quiet inevitability that felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The warmth of his hand spread through me like recognition, like something I'd been waiting to feel again, but never believed I would. "This time," he whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." I didn't realize my eyes were wet until he brushed his thumb over the back of my hand. Carefully, reverently, like the moment itself was something fragile he wanted to protect. Outside, the wind rattled the diner's windows. Inside, the world fell still. Not perfect, not simple, not easy, but real. We stayed there long after my food went cold, our hands resting together over the scratched diner table. Two lives reconnecting where neither of us expected. Quietly, unexpectedly, beautifully. And for the first time in years, I knew something with absolute clarity. Some love stories don't end. If you enjoyed this emotional journey and want more slow burn stories like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Red heart. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think the younger man and the older man should fully commit to a relationship now that they've reunited? Or are there still things they need to face before taking that step? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them.